Dixon Hollow, Kentucky, March 18th, 1976, 4:47 in the morning. The pre-dawn darkness sits heavy over the Appalachian hills as 15 men gather outside the Dixon Hollow mine entrance, their headlamps cutting small circles of light through the fog that rolls down from the ridges. The temperature hovers just above freezing, cold enough that breath comes out in visible clouds, warm enough that the mud underfoot hasn't quite frozen solid. These men have made this walk hundreds of times before, descending into the earth to extract the coal that keeps eastern Kentucky's economy alive and their families fed. But this morning will be different. This morning they're walking into an execution. Clayton Barnes, the shift foreman, does a quick head count as the crew assembles near the mine entrance, 15 men total, 3 drilling operators, 4 blasters, 2 equipment runners, 3 cart handlers, 2 ventilation specialists, and Barnes himself overseeing the operation. It's a standard crew size for what should be a standard shift. They're scheduled to work Section 7 of the Dixon Hollow seam, extending the main tunnel another 60 feet deeper into the mountain. The work is dangerous, like all coal mining, but routine. They've drilled this particular seam for 8 months without major incident. There's no reason to think today will be any different. Except there is a reason, and Barnes knows it, even if he's choosing to ignore it. 2 days earlier, Barnes received a memo from Dixon Hollow Mine Management. The memo, typed on company letterhead and marked urgent, contained a simple instruction: do not drill beyond the current tunnel terminus in Section 7. Do not approach the boundary marker. Do not, under any circumstances, breach the wall that separates Dixon Hollow's operation from the adjacent Harlan Mining Corporation property. The memo didn't explain why. It didn't need to. Everyone who worked these mountains knew about the boundary dispute between the two companies. Everyone knew the situation had gotten tense over the past year. And everyone knew that when coal companies start sending urgent memos about not crossing property lines, it means there's money involved, the kind of money that makes people nervous and unpredictable. Barnes folded that memo and put it in his desk drawer. He didn't share it with the crew. He made a calculation, the same calculation that coal miners and their supervisors have been making in Appalachia for 100 years. The calculation that says the coal is more important than the warning. That production targets matter more than abstract threats from rival companies. That feeding your family today matters more than worrying about what might happen if you drill 20 feet past an arbitrary line. The call comes through to the Dixon Hollow surface station at 7:03 in the morning. It's not the normal check-in from the underground crew. It's not Clayton Barnes reporting progress or requesting additional equipment. It's the emergency line, the frequency that's supposed to stay silent unless something catastrophic has happened. The voice on the other end belongs to Jimmy Garrett, one of the ventilation specialists who stayed near the main shaft while the rest of the crew pushed deeper into Section 7. His voice is shaking so badly that the surface supervisor, a man named Dale Hutchins, can barely understand what he's saying. But 3 words come through clearly: they're all dead. Hutchins doesn't believe it at first. Radio communications from underground can be garbled by interference from the drilling equipment and the layers of rock between the surface and the working tunnels. He asks Garrett to repeat. Garrett does, and this time there's no mistaking what he's saying. The crew in Section 7 is dead. All of them. Hutchins needs to send rescue teams down immediately, but Garrett is screaming now. Actually screaming into the radio, saying that nobody should come down. that the men who did this might still be in the tunnels, that it's not safe, that there's blood everywhere. Hutchins makes 2 calls. The first is to Dixon Hollow Mine's main office in Harlan, 3 miles away. The second is to the Kentucky State Police. Within 20 minutes, the mine entrance is swarming with activity. Company officials arriving in pickup trucks. Police cruisers with lights flashing. An ambulance, though everyone already knows it's not going to be needed for rescue, only for body recovery. The state police organize a team to descend into the mine. 4 officers, 2 company safety inspectors, and 3 experienced miners who volunteer to guide the group through the tunnel system. They're equipped with weapons, something almost never brought into a coal mine. But Garrett's panicked description has made it clear this isn't a normal mining accident. The descent takes 11 minutes. The main shaft drops 400 feet at a steep angle before leveling out into the horizontal tunnels where the actual coal extraction happens. The air gets warmer as they descend, the natural heat of the earth radiating through the rock. Their headlamps illuminate wooden support beams, electrical cables running along the tunnel ceiling, and the narrow-gauge rail tracks used for moving coal carts. Everything looks normal until they reach Section 7. That's where normal ends. The first body is slumped against the tunnel wall about 30 feet from the Section 7 entrance. It's one of the cart handlers, a man named Thomas McCreary. He's been shot 3 times in the chest. The blood has pooled beneath him, soaking into the coal dust that covers the tunnel floor. His eyes are still open, fixed on nothing. The state police lieutenant leading the team, a veteran named Robert Childers, stops the group. He's seen violence before, but nothing like this. To understand how 15 men ended up executed in a coal mine tunnel, you need to understand the strip of land that caused it. The boundary dispute between Dixon Hollow Mine and Harlan Mining Corporation wasn't some recent disagreement. It had roots going back almost 60 years, to a time when coal mining in eastern Kentucky was even more chaotic and lawless than it became by the 1970s. The land in question was a narrow zone, roughly 200 feet wide and half a mile long, running through the heart of some of the richest coal deposits in Harlan County. On paper, the boundary should have been simple to establish. Survey the land, mark the property lines, and keep each company's operations on their respective sides. But nothing about coal mining in Appalachia was ever that simple. The original land grants in this part of Kentucky dated back to the 1800s, when the coal beneath the mountains wasn't considered particularly valuable, and the people who owned the surface land often had no idea what mineral rights meant. As coal became economically important in the early 20th century, companies began acquiring mineral rights through purchases, legal maneuvers, and occasionally outright fraud. The documentation was often sloppy. Property descriptions referred to landmarks that no longer existed or used measurements that didn't match modern surveying techniques. Multiple companies would sometimes claim rights to the same underground coal seams based on different interpretations of century-old deeds and contracts. The result was a patchwork of overlapping claims and disputed boundaries that led to lawsuits, occasionally to violence, and always to the kind of legal ambiguity that made operating a coal mine in Kentucky more about power and intimidation than clear property rights. The specific boundary between Dixon Hollow and Harlan Mining had been disputed since 1923, when both companies began operations in adjacent valleys. For decades, it didn't matter much. The coal seams that both companies were mining were separated by enough distance that their operations never came close to intersecting. Dixon Hollow worked the western slopes of the valley, extracting coal from seams that ran roughly north to south. Harlan Mining focused on the eastern side, following different geological formations. The disputed zone in between was considered low-grade coal, not worth the effort and expense of deep shaft mining. Both companies knew the boundary was unclear, but neither cared enough to spend money on lawyers and surveyors to settle a dispute over land that had no immediate economic value. That changed in 1974. A new geological survey of Harlan County, commissioned by the state as part of a broader assessment of Kentucky's coal reserves, revealed something that previous surveys had missed. The disputed zone between Dixon Hollow and Harlan Mining sat directly above a previously unknown extension of the premium-grade coal seam that ran through the region. This wasn't the low-grade coal that both companies had assumed filled that area. This was high BTU coal, the kind that burned hotter and cleaner, the kind that power plants and industrial facilities paid premium prices for. The survey estimated there were approximately 4 million tons of recoverable coal in that narrow strip of disputed territory. At 1974 prices, that represented roughly $60 million in potential revenue. Suddenly, the boundary that nobody had cared about for 50 years became the most valuable piece of land in Harlan County. Dixon Hollow Mine was the smaller operation. It was owned by Appalachian Coal Company, a regional firm that operated 6 mines across eastern Kentucky and employed roughly 800 people total. Appalachian Coal wasn't a major player in the industry. It didn't have the political connections or financial resources of the big corporations that dominated coal extraction in the 1970s. What it had was local knowledge, relationships with Harlan County families who'd been mining coal for generations, and a reputation for running relatively safe operations by the standards of an industry where safety was often treated as an expensive inconvenience. The Dixon Hollow mine had been operating since 1958, working a coal seam that produced decent quality coal in sufficient quantities to keep the company profitable. Nothing spectacular, but steady work that supported about 60 families in the Hollow and the surrounding communities. Harlan Mining Corporation was different. It was owned by Consolidated Energy Industries, a multinational conglomerate based in Pittsburgh that operated mines across Appalachia and had annual revenues in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Harlan Mining wasn't interested in being a good neighbor or maintaining relationships with local communities. It was interested in extracting as much coal as possible, as quickly as possible, with as little expense as possible, and shipping it to power plants and steel mills that didn't care where the coal came from as long as it burned hot and arrived on schedule. Harlan Mining employed roughly 300 people at its main facility, but most of them weren't local. The company brought in workers from out of state, housed them in company-owned trailers, and rotated crews through on schedules that prioritized production over everything else. The company had been fined multiple times by federal mine safety inspectors for violations ranging from inadequate ventilation to failure to maintain proper roof supports. The fines were always paid, nothing ever changed, and the coal kept flowing. When the 1974 geological survey revealed the premium coal seam under the disputed boundary zone, both companies immediately began legal proceedings to establish their claim to the territory. Dixon Hollow's parent company, Appalachian Coal, argued that their historical mining operations had always extended to the eastern edge of what they considered their property, which included the disputed zone. They produced deeds and survey maps dating back to the 1920s, showing their understanding of where the boundary lay. Harlan Mining Corporation countered with their own documentation, showing a different boundary interpretation that placed the disputed zone entirely within their mineral rights. Both sets of documents were technically valid under different readings of the original land grants. Both companies hired lawyers. The case began working its way through Kentucky's court system, a process that everyone involved knew would take years to resolve. But coal companies don't wait for courts when there's money involved. By early 1975, both Dixon Hollow and Harlan Mining had begun extending their tunnel operations toward the disputed zone. Neither company was technically violating any court orders, because no court had yet ruled on where the actual boundary was located. Both were simply continuing their normal mining operations, which happened to be heading directly toward the same underground coal seam from opposite directions. Dixon Hollow approached from the west, extending their Section 7 tunnel. Harlan Mining approached from the east, extending what they called their north expansion shaft. The two operations were drilling toward each other through hundreds of feet of solid rock, and everyone involved knew that eventually, probably sometime in 1976, those tunnels were going to meet. What nobody publicly acknowledged was what would happen when they did. The geological survey that sparked the boundary dispute wasn't conducted by either coal company. It was commissioned by the Kentucky Department of Natural Resources as part of a comprehensive assessment of the state's mineral reserves, a project that had been ongoing since 1972 and covered every major coal-producing county in eastern Kentucky. The survey team used modern techniques that previous assessments hadn't employed, including seismic testing and core sample analysis that could detect coal seam characteristics at depths and locations that older surveys had missed. The data was collected throughout 1973 and early 1974. The final report was published in August 1974 and distributed to state agencies, academic institutions, and through public records requests to any coal company interested in the findings. Both Dixon Hollow and Harlan Mining obtained copies within days of publication. The section covering Harlan County contained detailed maps showing coal seam locations, depths, and quality ratings. Page 47 of the report included a map that showed something neither company had previously known. The premium-grade coal seam that both companies had been mining in their respective territories wasn't two separate seams. It was a single continuous formation that extended through the disputed boundary zone between their properties. More significantly, the report indicated that the coal in the boundary zone had higher BTU ratings than what either company was currently extracting. The survey estimated the seam in the disputed area ran between 8 and 12 feet thick, which is exceptionally good by Appalachian coal mining standards. Most seams in the region average 4 to 6 feet. A thick seam means more coal can be extracted from the same amount of tunnel drilling and excavation, which translates directly to higher profits. The report included a detailed analysis of what it called boundary zone delta, the technical designation for the disputed area between Dixon Hollow and Harlan Mining. The analysis noted that this zone had never been mined because of uncertainty about mineral rights ownership, but that it represented one of the most economically valuable unmined coal deposits in Harlan County. The report didn't make any recommendations about who should have rights to mine the zone. That wasn't the survey's purpose. It simply documented what was there and what it was worth. But by quantifying the value so precisely, the report transformed an abstract boundary dispute into a concrete calculation of how much money was at stake. $60 million is an abstract number. 4 million tons of premium coal is concrete, real, something worth fighting for. Within weeks of the report's publication, both companies began making moves. Dixon Hollow's parent company, Appalachian Coal, filed a formal claim with the Kentucky Department of Natural Resources, asserting their mineral rights to the entirety of Boundary Zone Delta. They argued that historical mining operations and their interpretation of original land grants gave them clear ownership. Harlan Mining Corporation filed a competing claim within 48 hours, arguing the exact opposite. Both companies requested expedited legal proceedings to settle the dispute. Neither company wanted to wait years for a resolution. The coal wasn't going anywhere, but market conditions were favorable in 1974, and both companies wanted to begin extraction before economic conditions changed or federal regulations made mining more expensive. The court case was assigned to Judge Warren Mitchell in Harlan County Circuit Court. Judge Mitchell was 72 years old, had been on the bench for 38 years, and had overseen more coal mining disputes than any other judge in eastern Kentucky. He understood that these cases were never really about legal principles or property rights. They were about money and power, and which company had more of both. He scheduled an initial hearing for November 1974, took testimony from both sides, and then did what judges usually do in complicated property disputes. He ordered both companies to maintain current operations while legal proceedings continued. And he scheduled the next hearing for 6 months later. That order, meant to preserve the status quo, actually guaranteed that tensions would escalate. The first explicit threat came in January 1975 during a meeting that was supposed to be about coordination and safety. The Kentucky Mine Safety Board, concerned about two major operations drilling toward each other through the same mountain, mandated a joint meeting between Dixon Hollow and Harlan Mining representatives to discuss protocols for avoiding accidental intersection of their tunnels. The meeting was held at the Harlan County Courthouse, a neutral location where both companies could send their representatives without appearing to give ground to the other side. Dixon Hollow sent Clayton Barnes, who was already serving as senior foreman, along with 2 company engineers. Harlan Mining sent their operations manager, a man named Victor Drucker, and their chief mining engineer, along with a lawyer from Consolidated Energy Industries headquarters in Pittsburgh. The meeting started with the technical discussion it was supposed to cover. The engineers from both companies spread survey maps across the conference table and marked their current tunnel positions. Dixon Hollow's Section 7 had extended approximately 340 feet from their main shaft. Harlan Mining's north expansion had progressed roughly 400 feet from their side. Based on both companies' understanding of where the boundary should be, the 2 tunnels were separated by somewhere between 200 and 400 feet of solid rock. The uncertainty came from the disputed boundary location. If Dixon Hollow's legal interpretation was correct, they could drill another 100 feet before reaching the boundary. If Harlan Mining's interpretation was correct, Dixon Hollow was already close to crossing into Harlan's territory. The engineers proposed that both companies halt drilling at their current positions until the court resolved the boundary dispute. That proposal lasted about 5 minutes before Victor Drucker rejected it completely. Drucker was not a coal miner. He came from Consolidated Energy's corporate management structure, with a background in industrial engineering and cost optimization rather than the practical experience of working underground. He'd been brought in to run Harlan Mining specifically because headquarters wanted someone who would prioritize production and profit over the traditional relationships and informal agreements that characterized coal mining in Appalachia. He told the Dixon Hollow representatives that Harlan Mining would continue normal operations according to their approved mining plan, which included extending the north expansion shaft. He said that if Dixon Hollow continued drilling toward what Harlan Mining considered their property, there would be consequences. Clayton Barnes asked what kind of consequences Drucker meant. Drucker didn't elaborate. He just repeated that there would be consequences and that Dixon Hollow should take that statement seriously. The Dixon Hollow representatives reported the meeting and Drucker's comments to their management. The response from Appalachian Coal Company headquarters was to continue operations as planned. The company's position was that they had legitimate mineral rights to the disputed zone, that no court had ruled otherwise, and that they weren't going to surrender potentially valuable coal seams because a corporate manager from Pittsburgh made vague threats. The company's lawyers assured Dixon Hollow management that Drucker's comments were just intimidation tactics, the kind of posturing that happened in every mining dispute, and that actual violence between coal companies hadn't happened in Kentucky since the bloody Union conflicts of the 1930s and 40s. The lawyers were confident that modern corporate mining operations didn't settle disputes with violence. They were wrong. Over the following months, the warnings became more explicit. In March 1975, someone left a dead dog at the entrance to Dixon Hollow Mine with a note attached that read, "Stop digging, or this is you." In May, 2 Dixon Hollow miners were confronted in a Harlan County bar by men who claimed to work for Harlan Mining and told them that anyone who drilled past the boundary wouldn't make it out of the tunnels alive. In August, someone fired rifle shots at a Dixon Hollow supply truck on the mountain road leading to the mine entrance. Nobody was hit, but the message was clear. These incidents were reported to local police, who investigated but never identified suspects. The prevailing attitude among law enforcement was that these were isolated incidents, probably the work of individual hotheads rather than company-sanctioned intimidation, and that things would calm down once the court case was resolved. Thomas McCreary was 32 years old. He'd worked at Dixon Hollow Mine for 6 years, ever since he came back from Vietnam, where he'd served as an infantry soldier with the 101st Airborne. He didn't talk much about the war, but everyone who worked with him knew the experience had changed him in ways that never quite healed. He was quiet, reliable, showed up for every shift, and did his job without complaint. He lived in a small house 3 miles from the mine with his wife Patricia and their 2 daughters, ages 7 and 9. His job as a cart handler wasn't glamorous or particularly skilled. He moved coal from the drilling areas to the main transport lines, operating the electric carts that ran on the narrow gauge rails through the tunnels. It was physical work that paid decent wages by Harlan County standards. He was saving money to eventually buy a better house, maybe somewhere away from the coal mines, though he never seriously believed he'd actually leave. This was what men in his family did. His father had mined coal. His grandfather had mined coal. It was the only real employment available in Dixon Hollow. Raymond Foster was 41 years old and had been a drilling operator for 18 years, all of them at Dixon Hollow. He was considered one of the best in the mine, someone who could read the rock and sense when a seam was about to shift or when the drilling needed to be adjusted to avoid breaking through into unstable areas. He taught most of the younger drillers their trade, including supervising Clayton Barnes when Barnes first started underground work 15 years earlier. Raymond had 5 children, ages ranging from 19 down to 11. His oldest son had joined the Army and was stationed in Germany. His oldest daughter was married and living in Lexington. The other 3 were still at home, still in school, still depending on the money Raymond brought home every week. He was a deacon at the Baptist church in town and coached Little League baseball in the summers. Everyone in Dixon Hollow knew Raymond. Everyone liked him. He was the kind of man who represented what was good about these mountain communities. James Sullivan was 23 years old and had been working at Dixon Hollow for only 8 months. He was new to coal mining, having grown up in Lexington with ambitions of going to college and getting away from the poverty that defined so much of eastern Kentucky. But college required money his family didn't have, and student loans weren't something his father trusted or understood. So James did what young men from Kentucky had been doing for generations. He came to the coal mines because that's where the work was. He planned to save money for 2 or 3 years, then use it to pay for school. He was smart, probably too smart for the work he was doing, and some of the older miners found his ambition naive but admirable. He sent money home to his parents every month and wrote letters to his girlfriend who was finishing her degree at the University of Kentucky. Those letters talked about the future they were planning together, a future that would start as soon as he saved enough money to leave the mines behind. Michael Hendricks was 37 and had worked various jobs in the coal industry since he was 17 years old. He'd done everything from cart handling to drilling to equipment maintenance. He knew more about keeping mining equipment running than anyone else at Dixon Hollow, which made him valuable enough that the company paid him slightly above standard wages. He was divorced, paid child support for 2 kids he rarely saw, and lived in a trailer by himself, about 5 miles from the mine. He drank too much, everyone knew it. But he never drank before work, and he never let it affect his job performance. His co-workers considered him reliable when it mattered. He'd grown up in Harlan County and would probably die there. He didn't have dreams of leaving or getting out. This was his life, and he'd accepted it. David Cole was 51 years old and should have retired already. He'd been mining coal for 33 years and had the lung problems to prove it. He coughed constantly, especially in the mornings, bringing up black phlegm that was a mixture of coal dust and damaged lung tissue. But retirement wasn't financially possible. His wife had medical bills from cancer treatment that had mostly worked, but left them deeply in debt. His pension from the mine wouldn't be enough to cover those bills and maintain their house and survive. So he kept working, kept going underground, kept breathing air that was slowly killing him, because the alternative was financial ruin. He was 2 years away from qualifying for full retirement benefits. He just needed to make it 2 more years. Clayton Barnes received the March 16th memo on the morning of March 17th, 1 day before the massacre. It was delivered by a company courier who drove from Appalachian Coal headquarters, specifically to hand deliver it to Barnes at the mine site. The memo was marked urgent and confidential. It instructed Barnes to immediately halt all drilling operations in Section 7 of Dixon Hollow Mine. The memo explained that the company's legal team had received information suggesting that Harlan Mining Corporation was preparing to take aggressive action to prevent Dixon Hollow from drilling into the disputed boundary zone. The nature of this aggressive action wasn't specified, but the memo's tone made clear that management considered the threat credible and serious. Barnes was ordered to suspend operations in Section 7 until further notice, redirect his crew to other areas of the mine, and under no circumstances approach within 50 feet of the estimated boundary location. Barnes read the memo 3 times. Each time, he got angrier. He'd been running crews at Dixon Hollow for 8 years. He understood mining operations, safety protocols, and how to keep men alive underground. What he didn't understand was corporate management making decisions based on legal threats rather than mining realities. Section 7 was currently the most productive area of Dixon Hollow Mine. The coal seam they were following was thick, high quality, and running true with minimal faulting or geological complications. Redirecting operations to other sections would mean lower coal production, which would mean the mine would miss its quarterly targets, which would mean potential layoffs or reduced hours for the crew. Barnes had 15 men depending on those paychecks. He had families counting on the overtime that productive sections generated. And he had his own reputation as a foreman who delivered results. Beyond the practical considerations, Barnes had his own opinions about the boundary dispute. He'd grown up in Harlan County. He knew the history of coal mining in these mountains. He knew that boundaries were often unclear, and that companies like Harlan Mining, the big corporate operations, would use legal intimidation to steal coal that rightfully belonged to smaller companies like Appalachian Coal. In Barnes's view, stopping operations in Section 7 wasn't prudence, it was surrender. It was letting Pittsburgh lawyers and corporate thugs dictate how Kentucky coal miners did their jobs. That offended something fundamental in Barnes's understanding of how things should work. These were his tunnels, his crew, his mountain. He wasn't going to be ordered around by people who'd never spent a day underground. Barnes made his decision. He would ignore the memo. He would continue operations in Section 7 exactly as planned. He would drill toward that coal seam in the disputed zone, because that's where the best coal was located and because no court had ruled that Appalachian Coal didn't have rights to it. If Harlan Mining wanted to contest it, they could do it through lawyers and judges, not through threats that were probably empty anyway. Barnes had worked in coal mines his entire adult life. He'd seen disputes between companies before. They always got resolved through legal proceedings or negotiated settlements. Nobody actually got hurt. The idea that Harlan Mining would physically attack his crew seemed absurd, the kind of thing that might have happened 50 years ago, but not in 1976. On the evening of March 17th, Barnes assembled his crew for the next day's shift and briefed them on their assignments. They would continue extending Section 7, drilling another planned advance of 15 feet into the coal seam. Barnes didn't mention the memo from management. He didn't tell his crew that headquarters had ordered operations suspended. He didn't share the warning about potential aggressive action from Harlan Mining. He simply gave them their assignments and told them to be ready for a normal shift starting at 5 in the morning. The men went home to their families, ate dinner, watched television, went to bed. They had no idea that their foreman had just made the decision that would get them killed. The drilling started at 5:23 in the morning on March 18th. The crew had descended into the mine at 4:50, spent 20 minutes checking equipment and reviewing the day's drilling plan, then moved through the main tunnel system to Section 7, where the active work was taking place. The Section 7 face, the end point where drilling was currently happening, was located approximately 357 feet from the main shaft entrance. The tunnel at this point was roughly 8 feet wide and 7 feet high, supported by timber posts and steel reinforcement beams that prevented roof collapse. The coal seam they were following ran at a slight upward angle, which was favorable because it meant water would naturally drain away from the working area rather than pooling. Ventilation was adequate, with forced air being pushed through flexible ducts from fans positioned back near the main shaft. Raymond Foster was operating the primary drill, a pneumatic rotary drill mounted on a mobile rig that could be positioned precisely against the coal face. The drill bit was 18 inches in diameter and 5 feet long, designed to bore deep holes into the coal that would then be packed with explosives for controlled blasting. The drilling process was loud, violent, and created massive amounts of dust, despite the water spray that was supposed to suppress it. Foster wore protective goggles, ear protection, and a respirator mask, though the mask was uncomfortable and most miners removed them as soon as supervisors weren't watching. Foster kept his on because he'd seen too many older miners destroyed by black lung disease, and he intended to avoid that fate if possible. The drill bit into the coal face at precisely 5:23. The coal at this depth was excellent quality, breaking away in large chunks rather than crumbling into dust, which meant good structural integrity and high BTU content. Foster had drilled thousands of holes in his career, and he could feel when the drill was working through good coal versus poor coal, or hitting rock, or encountering geological faults. This was good coal, some of the best he'd worked in the 2 years since Section 7 had been opened. He drilled the first hole to a depth of 4.5 feet, then withdrew the drill and repositioned the rig to bore the next hole in the pattern that would create the blast layout. The second hole went smoothly, the third hole went smoothly. On the fourth hole, at 5:41 in the morning, something changed. The drill bit punched through the coal face and suddenly lost resistance. Foster felt it immediately, that sudden change in feedback that meant the drill had broken through into empty space instead of solid material. That shouldn't happen. There shouldn't be empty space on the other side of this coal face, unless there was a natural cave or void in the rock, which was possible but unusual in this geological formation, or unless the drill had just broken through into another tunnel, which meant they'd just breached the boundary and broken into Harlan Mining's operation. Foster immediately stopped the drill and withdrew the bit. He called for Clayton Barnes to come a look at what had happened. Barnes walked over from where he'd been supervising the cart positioning and examined the hole Foster had just drilled. Air was moving through the hole. Not natural air movement from geological caves, but forced air that smelled like diesel exhaust and carried the sounds of machinery. That meant an active mining operation on the other side. That meant they just drilled into Harlan Mining's north expansion shaft. Barnes stood there for perhaps 30 seconds, processing what this meant. They'd reached the boundary. They'd possibly crossed it, depending on whose interpretation of the boundary location was correct. And there were Harlan Mining workers on the other side of this wall who now knew The Dixon Hollow had broken through. Barnes made a decision. They'd pulled back, sealed this hole, and report what happened to management. It was the smart decision, the safe decision. He was about to give that order when the first gunshot came through the hole Foster had drilled. The bullet struck Raymond Foster in the throat. He was still standing next to the drill rig, still holding the control handles, still processing Barnes's instruction to shut down operations when the 9mm round came through the drill hole at 3,000 feet per second and tore through his neck just below his jaw. The bullet severed his carotid artery and shattered 2 vertebrae before exiting through the back of his neck and embedding itself in the tunnel wall 15 feet behind him. Foster dropped instantly, his body collapsing against the drill rig before sliding to the tunnel floor. Blood poured from the entry and exit wounds, spreading across the coal dust in a dark pool that looked black in the artificial light from the headlamps. He was still alive, drowning in his own blood, unable to scream or call for help, because the bullet had destroyed his ability to breathe or speak. He died approximately 45 seconds later while his crew members watched in paralyzed horror. The second shot came 3 seconds after the first. This one was aimed more carefully, fired by someone who'd positioned themselves directly against the drill hole and was shooting through it into the Dixon Hollow tunnel. The bullet hit James Sullivan in the chest, penetrating his left lung and lodging against his spine. Sullivan staggered backward, crashed into one of the support posts, and fell. He was screaming, a high-pitched sound that echoed through the tunnels and mixed with the sudden chaos of men who'd just watched their coworker get shot and didn't understand what was happening or where the shots were coming from. Someone yelled to run. Someone else yelled to take cover. Clayton Barnes was shouting for everyone to move back toward the main shaft, to get away from the Section 7 face, to retreat to safety while they figured out what was happening. But there was no safety. The drill hole that Raymond Foster had created was approximately 3 inches in diameter after the drill bit had chewed through the coal. That was large enough for bullets to pass through, but it wasn't large enough to see who was shooting or how many attackers were on the other side of the wall. What the Dixon Hollow crew didn't know, what they couldn't know until it was too late, was that Harlan Mining hadn't accidentally encountered their drill breakthrough. Harlan Mining had been waiting for it. They'd known for weeks that Dixon Hollow was approaching the boundary. They'd monitored the progress of Section 7 through their own seismic sensors that detected drilling vibrations. They'd prepared for this moment, positioned men with weapons near their tunnel face, and given orders that when Dixon Hollow broke through, everyone on the other side would be eliminated. The attackers began using explosives to widen the breach. Small-shaped charges placed against the coal wall, not large enough to cause tunnel collapse, but sufficient to blow chunks of coal and rock away and create an opening large enough for people to move through. The explosions were deafening in the confined space, temporarily disorienting everyone in both tunnels. Coal dust filled the air, making it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet, even with headlamps. The Dixon Hollow crew was running now, scrambling back through Section 7 toward the main tunnel system, desperate to reach the shaft that would take them to the surface. But the tunnel was narrow, cluttered with equipment, and filled with smoke and dust. Men were colliding with each other, tripping over rail tracks and supply carts, losing their orientation in the chaos. The attackers came through the breach approximately 2 minutes after Raymond Foster was shot. There were 6 of them, all wearing the same coveralls and helmets that coal miners wore, all carrying handguns or short-barreled shotguns that were practical for close-quarters combat in confined spaces. They weren't Harlan Mining's regular employees. They were contractors, men hired specifically for this job, brought in from outside Kentucky, and paid to ensure that Dixon Hollow's crew never reported what had happened here. They moved through the tunnel with tactical precision, spreading out to cover multiple angles, using their weapons efficiently and without hesitation. They weren't trying to scare the Dixon Hollow miners away. They were executing them systematically, one by one, as the trapped men tried desperately to escape through tunnels that had suddenly become killing zones. The massacre had begun. At 5:43 in the morning, approximately 2 minutes after Raymond Foster was shot, the surface station at Dixon Hollow Mine registered a brief radio transmission from Section 7. The transmission was garbled, broken by static and interference, but the words "shots fired" came through clearly enough that Dale Hutchins, monitoring communications from the surface, immediately tried to establish contact with Clayton Barnes. Hutchins called Barnes's radio frequency 3 times in rapid succession. No response. He switched to the general crew frequency and called for anyone in Section 7 to respond. No response. He tried Raymond Foster's personal radio. No response. For the next 4 minutes, Hutchins attempted to raise someone, anyone, from the underground crew. The only thing coming through his radio was static and the occasional burst of what might have been voices, but was too distorted to understand. At 5:47, Hutchins made a decision that would later be questioned during the investigation. Instead of immediately calling for emergency response or sending rescue teams underground, he assumed the communication failure was technical rather than an actual emergency. Radio problems were common in Dixon Hollow Mine. The rock layers interfered with transmissions. Equipment malfunctioned. Miners accidentally damaged cables or knocked radios against tunnel walls hard enough to break them. The phrase "shots fired" that Hutchins thought he heard could have been something else entirely, distorted by static into words that sounded like an emergency. Hutchins decided to wait 15 minutes to see if communications would restore themselves before escalating the situation. It was a reasonable decision based on his experience with communication failures. It was also a decision that meant nobody on the surface knew men were dying underground while he waited for technical problems to resolve. By 6:02 in the morning, Hutchins was genuinely worried. 15 minutes of complete radio silence from an entire crew was unusual, even for Dixon Hollow's temperamental communication systems. He called Jimmy Garrett, the ventilation specialist who was stationed near the main shaft entrance about 200 feet from where Section 7 branched off the main tunnel. Garrett's radio still wasn't responding. Hutchins tried the emergency frequency, the backup system that was supposed to work even when primary communications failed. Nothing. At 6:05, Hutchins made the call he should have made 20 minutes earlier. He contacted Dixon Hollow's main office and reported a potential emergency underground. The office manager, a woman named Susan Crawford, told Hutchins to send someone down to physically check on the crew, rather than waiting for radio contact to restore. Hutchins assembled 2 miners who were on surface duty that morning, men who knew the tunnel system well enough to navigate to Section 7 quickly. He gave them specific instructions. Go down the main shaft, proceed to Section 7, assess the situation, and report back immediately via radio. If their radios didn't work underground, they should return to the surface and deliver their report in person. Under no circumstances should they attempt any rescue operations on their own. If there was an actual emergency, proper rescue teams with equipment would need to be organized. The two miners, whose names were Carl Dennison and Robert Price, descended into the mine at 6:11 in the morning. Their journey to Section 7 would normally take about 12 minutes at a steady walking pace through the tunnels. At 6:23, exactly 12 minutes after Dennison and Price had entered the mine, their voices came through on the emergency frequency. Hutchins could barely understand what they were saying because both men were speaking at the same time, their voices high-pitched with panic, competing with each other to describe what they'd found. Hutchins had to tell them 3 times to slow down and report clearly. What came through was fragmentary but sufficient. Bodies in the tunnel. Blood everywhere. The crew from Section 7 was dead. All of them appeared to be dead. Dennison and Price hadn't gone all the way to the Section 7 face because what they'd encountered in the main tunnel had been enough. They'd found Thomas McCreary first, shot and slumped against the tunnel wall. Then they'd found 3 more bodies within 50 feet of McCreary. All appeared to have gunshot wounds. The tunnel beyond that point was dark because someone had destroyed the electrical lines that powered the lighting systems. Hutchins made the 2 critical calls at 6:25. First to Dixon Hollow's main office, reporting that there had been what appeared to be a mass shooting underground and that emergency response needed to be mobilized immediately. Second to Kentucky State Police, reporting the same information and requesting that law enforcement respond to what was now a crime scene rather than a mining accident. The state police dispatcher asked Hutchins if the shooter was still in the mine. Hutchins didn't know. He hadn't considered that possibility. He told Dennison and Price, who were still underground and still transmitting on the emergency frequency, to get out of the mine immediately and not to approach the Section 7 area any further. If whoever did this was still in the tunnels, 2 unarmed miners weren't going to be able to stop them. The emergency response that followed was chaotic but remarkably fast. Within 20 minutes of Hutchins's call, Dixon Hollow Mine's entrance was surrounded by company officials, local police, volunteer firefighters who served as auxiliary rescue personnel, and ambulances from 3 different counties. Within 30 minutes, Kentucky State Police had organized a tactical team to enter the mine with weapons drawn, prepared to confront whoever had killed the Dixon Hollow crew. What nobody understood yet was that the shooters were already gone. They'd completed their mission, eliminated the witnesses, and retreated back through the breach into Harlan Mining's north expansion shaft. By the time anyone on the surface knew there had been an attack, the attackers had already traveled through Harlan Mining's tunnel system to their own exit point, 3 miles away, emerged onto a mountain road where vehicles were waiting, and begun the process of disappearing into identities and locations that would take investigators months to uncover. Lieutenant Robert Childers from Kentucky State Police led the first tactical team into Dixon Hollow Mine at 6:57 in the morning. His team consisted of 4 state police officers, 2 with tactical response training, plus 2 Dixon Hollow safety inspectors who knew the tunnel layout and could guide the team through the mine's passages. They were armed with service pistols and shotguns, equipped with high-powered flashlights that supplemented their mining headlamps, and connected to surface communications through radio systems that worked more reliably than the mine's internal network. Their orders were to secure the scene, locate any survivors, identify threats, and preserve evidence for what was now officially a homicide investigation rather than a mining accident. They found Thomas McCreary first, exactly where Carl Dennison had reported seeing him 30 minutes earlier. McCreary was definitely dead. The blood pooled beneath him had stopped spreading, which meant his heart had stopped pumping. His eyes were still open, fixed in the direction of Section 7, as though he'd been watching something approach when he died. Childers examined the body without touching it, preserving the scene for forensic investigators who would document everything in detail. The gunshot wounds were obvious. 3 entry points in the chest, close grouping, fired by someone who knew how to shoot. The distance was harder to determine without proper analysis, but Childers estimated the shots had been fired from relatively close range, probably less than 30 feet. McCreary had been running when he was shot, trying to escape from something, and whoever shot him had been chasing him through the tunnel. 50 feet beyond McCreary, they found 3 more bodies clustered together near a section where the tunnel made a slight turn. These were cart handlers and equipment operators who'd been working in Section 7 when the attack began. All 3 had been shot multiple times. One had defensive wounds on his hands and arms, suggesting he'd tried to shield himself or fight back. Another had been shot in the back, killed while running away. The third had apparently tripped or been knocked down and was shot while lying on the ground, the bullet angles indicating the shooter had been standing over him. The violence was methodical and thorough. These weren't warning shots or attempts to wound. These were execution-style killings, performed by people who intended to leave no survivors. The tunnel beyond this point showed signs of sustained gunfight. Bullet holes in the wooden support posts, damage to electrical conduits, broken equipment scattered across the tunnel floor. The Dixon Hollow crew had apparently tried to take cover behind mining carts and equipment, using whatever was available for protection while attempting to return fire or escape. Childers found 3 pistols on the ground near defensive positions, personal weapons that some of the miners had been carrying. Kentucky coal miners often carried firearms underground, technically against regulations, but practically tolerated because the regulations were rarely enforced and the miners considered weapons necessary for protection against various threats, both human and animal. But pistols against organized attackers with tactical advantages had been futile. Section 7 itself was the worst. The tunnel face where Raymond Foster had been operating the drill was covered in blood and tissue. Foster's body was still there, lying next to the drill rig where he'd fallen. The drill hole that had started this massacre was now a gaping breach in the tunnel wall, approximately 4 feet wide and 5 feet high, large enough for people to move through easily. Through that breach, Childers could see into Harlan Mining's north expansion shaft. The lights were still on in that tunnel, powered by Harlan Mining's electrical systems. The tunnel appeared empty. Whoever had come through that breach to attack the Dixon Hollow crew had long since withdrawn. Childers counted bodies. 14 total between the Section 7 face and Thomas McCreary's position near the main tunnel. That matched the crew roster that Dixon Hollow management had provided, which listed 15 men on the shift. 1 person was unaccounted for. Either they'd escaped and were somewhere else in the tunnel system, possibly injured and unable to respond to calls, or their body was in a location the tactical team hadn't reached yet. Childers split his team sending 2 officers to search the remaining sections of tunnel, while he and the others continued documenting the scene at Section 7. 20 minutes later, the search team reported finding the 15th victim in a side passage approximately 100 feet from the main massacre site. This miner had apparently tried to hide in an equipment storage area, crawling behind supply crates and turning off his headlamp to avoid detection. He'd been found anyway and shot 3 times at close range. Harlan Mining Corporation's official statement was released at 11:30 in the morning on March 18th, approximately 5 hours after the massacre. The statement was brief, carefully worded, and completely false. It expressed shock and sadness at the tragic mining accident that had occurred at Dixon Hollow Mine, extended condolences to the families of the miners who had lost their lives, and offered Harlan Mining's full cooperation with any investigation into what had happened. The statement characterized the incident as a catastrophic structural failure, possibly caused by Dixon Hollow's drilling operations, destabilizing rock formations near the boundary between the 2 companies' properties. It suggested that Dixon Hollow had been operating recklessly, drilling into areas where geological surveys had warned against excavation, and that the company's disregard for safety protocols had led to the deaths of 15 men. The statement made no mention of gunshots, violence, or deliberate killing. It framed everything as an industrial accident, the kind of tragedy that occasionally happened in coal mining when companies cut corners or failed to follow proper engineering standards. It positioned Harlan Mining as a responsible corporate neighbor that had repeatedly warned Dixon Hollow about the dangers of drilling near the disputed boundary zone, warnings that Dixon Hollow management had apparently ignored. The statement included quotes from Victor Drucker, Harlan Mining's operations manager, expressing his personal grief at the loss of life and his company's commitment to cooperating with investigators to ensure that lessons learned from this tragedy would prevent similar accidents in the future. The statement was distributed to every major newspaper in Kentucky, to regional television stations, and to industry publications that covered coal mining. It was picked up by wire services and reported nationally, establishing the narrative that would dominate initial media coverage of the Dixon Hollow incident. Mining accident in Kentucky kills 15. Company disputes over property boundaries may have contributed to unsafe drilling practices. Families demand answers about why safety warnings were ignored. The story fit familiar patterns of coal mining tragedies in Appalachia. Companies prioritizing production over safety. Workers dying because management made reckless decisions. Regulatory agencies failing to prevent disasters that everyone knew were coming. It was a story that had been told dozens of times before, and media coverage treated it as another example of an ongoing problem rather than something unprecedented and deliberate. But the narrative started falling apart within hours. The Kentucky State Police tactical team that had entered Dixon Hollow Mine and documented the scene knew immediately that this wasn't an accident. The bullet holes, the shell casings they'd collected from the tunnel floor, the gunshot wounds on the bodies, all provided physical evidence that contradicted Harlan Mining's characterization of a structural failure or geological collapse. By early afternoon on March 18th, state police had briefed the county prosecutor on what they'd found underground. The prosecutor, a man named Douglas Webb, who'd held the position for 11 years and had prosecuted multiple murder cases, understood that this was potentially the largest mass homicide in Kentucky history. He immediately contacted the FBI field office in Louisville and requested federal assistance with an investigation that clearly crossed state lines and involved corporate entities with resources far beyond what county-level law enforcement could handle. The FBI dispatched a team of agents to Harlan County by the evening of March 18th. They arrived with forensic specialists, evidence collection equipment, and authorization to treat the Dixon Hollow mine as a federal crime scene. They interviewed witnesses, collected physical evidence, and began the process of reconstructing what had actually happened in those tunnels. By March 19th, less than 24 hours after the massacre, federal investigators had enough evidence to know that Harlan Mining Corporation's statement was not just inaccurate but deliberately misleading. They had shell casings from 9mm handguns and 12-gauge shotguns, neither of which are tools used in coal mining. They had bullet trajectories that showed the Dixon Hollow miners had been shot by people firing from the direction of Harlan Mining's north expansion shaft. They had testimony from Carl Dennison and Robert Price about what they'd seen when they first entered the tunnels. And they had the breach in the tunnel wall, clear evidence that someone had used explosives to create an opening between the two mines specifically to allow access for the attack. The discovery that one miner had survived came on March 20th, 2 days after the massacre, and it changed everything. Jimmy Garrett, the ventilation specialist who'd been stationed near the main shaft entrance when the attack began, hadn't been found with the other victims because he hadn't died in Section 7. When the shooting started, Garrett had been approximately 200 feet away from the Section 7 face, performing routine maintenance on the ventilation duct system that supplied fresh air to the working areas. He'd heard the gunshots, muffled by distance and rock, but unmistakable to anyone who'd grown up in Kentucky, where hunting was common, and the sound of firearms was familiar. His first assumption was that someone had accidentally discharged a weapon, a dangerous mistake, but not necessarily catastrophic. Then he'd heard multiple shots in rapid succession, followed by screaming that echoed through the tunnels, and he'd understood that something terrible was happening. Garrett's position near the main shaft gave him the option that the rest of the crew didn't have. He could run for the surface, climb the 400 feet of steep shaft tunnel, and reach safety before whoever was shooting made it to his location. But instead of running, Garrett did something that probably saved his life. He turned off his headlamp, moved into a side passage that housed backup ventilation equipment, and hid. His reasoning, which he later explained to investigators, was that if he ran for the main shaft, whoever was shooting might see his headlamp moving in the darkness and shoot him before he could escape. If he hid and stayed quiet, there was a chance the attackers wouldn't search every passage and wouldn't find him. It was a calculated gamble that required him to remain hidden in complete darkness while listening to his co-workers being murdered somewhere deeper in the mine. For approximately 45 minutes, Garrett remained motionless in his hiding place while the massacre unfolded in Section 7. He could hear gunshots, screaming that gradually diminished as more men died, and eventually the sounds of people moving through the main tunnel, their footsteps and voices carrying through passages that acted like acoustic amplification systems. The voices were discussing logistics in calm, business-like tones, talking about making sure everyone was dead and not leaving evidence that could identify who'd been there. Garrett recognized that these weren't voices he knew, not members of the Dixon Hollow crew or even miners from other shifts. These were strangers, professionals who'd come specifically to kill his friends and were now ensuring they'd completed their mission thoroughly. At some point during those 45 minutes, one of the attackers came within 20 feet of Garrett's hiding position. Garrett could see the beam from the person's headlamp sweeping across the tunnel walls, searching passages for anyone who might have escaped the main killing zone. Garrett pressed himself against the rock wall, controlled his breathing, and waited for the light to find him. But the attacker didn't search thoroughly. The side passage where Garrett was hiding was cluttered with equipment and appeared to be a dead end rather than a hiding place. After a few seconds, the attacker moved on, returning to the main tunnel, and eventually withdrawing with the rest of his team through the breach into Harlan Mining's territory. Garrett waited in the darkness for another 2 hours after the sounds of movement stopped, terrified that leaving his hiding place would mean being found and killed. When Garrett finally emerged and made the radio call that Dale Hutchins received at 7:03, he was psychologically traumatized but physically unharmed and able to provide testimony that no one else could give. He'd heard the attackers talking. He could describe their voices, their accents, the specific phrases they'd used. He'd seen their lights and could estimate how many people had been involved. Most importantly, he could testify that this had been a deliberate, organized attack rather than spontaneous violence or a mining accident. His testimony would become the foundation of the federal case against Harlan Mining Corporation and everyone involved in planning the massacre. But his survival also made him a target, because the people who'd killed 15 men to prevent them from testifying about breaching the boundary now had one witness whose testimony could destroy their cover story and send them to prison. The FBI investigation moved faster than anyone expected. Within 3 weeks of the massacre, federal agents had identified 4 of the 6 shooters who'd entered Dixon Hollow mine through the breach. They weren't Harlan Mining employees in any official capacity. They were contractors with backgrounds in private security and military operations, men who'd been hired through intermediary companies that specialized in providing what they euphemistically called asset protection services to corporations dealing with labor disputes or property conflicts. The contractors had been recruited specifically for the Dixon Hollow operation, brought into Kentucky from out of state, housed in motels under false names, and paid in cash that was later traced back to accounts controlled by Consolidated Energy Industries, Harlan Mining's parent corporation. The paper trail that connected these contractors to Harlan Mining was complex but traceable. Federal investigators subpoenaed financial records from multiple shell companies and discovered payments totaling $200,000 that had been transferred in the weeks leading up to the massacre. They found travel records showing the contractors had flown into Lexington, rented vehicles, and driven to Harlan County. They recovered motel registration records, credit card receipts, and surveillance footage from gas stations showing the contractors traveling together. Most damning, they found written communications between Victor Drucker and executives at Consolidated Energy headquarters discussing the need for permanent resolution of the Dixon Hollow boundary dispute and authorization for necessary measures to protect company interests. On April 9, 1976, federal agents arrested Victor Drucker at his home in Harlan. He was charged with 15 counts of conspiracy to commit murder, federal racketeering charges related to using interstate commerce to facilitate violent crimes, and obstruction of justice for his role in creating the false narrative about a mining accident. That same day, FBI agents arrested 3 Consolidated Energy executives in Pittsburgh on similar charges. The contractors who'd actually carried out the shootings were arrested over the following week in 3 different states. 2 were apprehended without incident. 1 attempted to flee and was captured after a brief manhunt. The remaining 3 were never found, having apparently left the country using false identities immediately after the massacre. The arrests generated national media attention that transformed the story from a regional mining tragedy into a corporate crime scandal. Major newspapers ran front-page stories about how a Fortune 500 company had hired contractors to murder workers who'd crossed a disputed property line. Television news broadcasts showed footage of executives being led from their offices in handcuffs. Congressional committees announced investigations into corporate violence in the mining industry. The narrative that Harlan Mining had tried to establish collapsed, completely under the weight of evidence that federal prosecutors presented in preliminary hearings. This wasn't a mining accident, it was premeditated mass murder orchestrated at the highest levels of a major corporation. The trials began in January 1977 and continued for 8 months. The federal government prosecuted the cases in Louisville rather than Harlan County, arguing that local sentiment and potential intimidation of witnesses required moving the proceedings to a venue where defendants couldn't exert influence through community connections or economic pressure. The first trial focused on the 4 contractors who'd been apprehended and were willing to testify in exchange for reduced sentences. All 4 pleaded guilty to murder charges and agreed to cooperate with prosecutors by providing detailed testimony about how they'd been recruited, what orders they'd received, and who'd given those orders. Their testimony established the chain of command that connected the actual shootings to corporate executives who'd authorized and funded the operation. Victor Drucker's trial was the most prominent. He faced 15 counts of first-degree murder under federal statutes that allowed prosecution for murders committed as part of racketeering activity. The prosecution's case was built on documentary evidence showing Drucker had communicated directly with the contractors, had coordinated their access to Harlan mining facilities, and had personally overseen the planning of what was internally referred to as the boundary enforcement operation. Drucker's defense argued that he'd never explicitly ordered anyone killed, that his communications about permanent resolution and necessary measures were vague corporate language that didn't constitute murder conspiracy, and that he'd been following orders from executives above him who'd made the actual decisions. The jury deliberated for 6 days before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Drucker was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms without possibility of parole. The Consolidated Energy executives faced similar charges but had far more resources for their defense. They hired prestigious law firms, filed dozens of pretrial motions challenging everything from evidence admissibility to federal jurisdiction, and attempted to negotiate plea agreements that would allow them to avoid trial entirely. 2 executives eventually pleaded guilty to reduced charges of conspiracy and obstruction in exchange for testimony against their co-defendants. They received sentences ranging from 12 to 20 years. The remaining executive went to trial and was acquitted on the most serious murder charges, but convicted on lesser counts of racketeering and obstruction. He was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison and was released after serving 5. The outcome was simultaneously historic and disappointing. No corporate executives in American history had ever been convicted of murder charges related to business operations. The Harlan Mining case established legal precedents for holding executives criminally responsible for violence committed by contractors they'd hired. But the sentences were uneven. The legal process took years, and many people connected to the massacre were never prosecuted. The 3 contractors who'd escaped were never found. Lower-level Harlan Mining employees who'd facilitated the operation were granted immunity in exchange for testimony. Consolidated Energy Industries paid fines totaling $12 million but remained in business, eventually selling off its coal mining operations and restructuring under a different corporate name. Justice had been partially served, but many felt it was insufficient given that 15 men had been murdered. Patricia McCreary, Thomas McCreary's widow, became the public face of the victims' families during the legal proceedings and the years that followed. She attended every day of Victor Drucker's trial, sitting in the front row of the courtroom gallery where Drucker would have to see her face whenever he looked toward the spectators. She gave dozens of media interviews describing what the massacre had done to her family. Her daughters, who'd been 7 and 9 when their father was killed, had struggled with trauma and grief that therapy and time couldn't fully heal. The older daughter had nightmares for years. The younger daughter refused to speak about her father at all, shutting down emotionally whenever anyone mentioned him. Patricia herself had been forced to sell their house because she couldn't afford the mortgage on her income alone. She'd moved in with her parents, worked 2 jobs to support her children, and spent whatever time remained advocating for other families affected by the massacre. The financial compensation that families received was complicated and inadequate. Appalachian Coal Company, Dixon Hollow Mine's parent corporation, paid workers compensation death benefits that averaged approximately $20,000 per victim, the standard amount for mining fatalities in Kentucky during the 1970s. The families filed civil lawsuits against Harlan Mining Corporation and Consolidated Energy Industries, seeking additional damages. Those lawsuits were eventually settled out of court for undisclosed amounts, but people familiar with the settlements estimated that families received between $150,000 and $300,000 each, depending on the victim's age, income, and number of dependents. The money helped, but it couldn't replace fathers, husbands, sons, brothers who'd been murdered for corporate profit. Beyond financial loss, the families struggled with psychological and social consequences that lasted for decades. Children grew up without fathers. Widows struggled with grief, anger, and the practical challenges of single parenthood in a region with limited economic opportunities. Some families left Harlan County entirely, unable to remain in communities where memories of the massacre were everywhere they looked. Others stayed but became withdrawn and isolated, unable to move past trauma that had fundamentally altered their lives. The massacre had ripple effects through entire communities, destroying not just 15 lives, but damaging hundreds more who'd been connected to the victims. The families also faced skepticism and hostility from people who blamed the victims for what happened. Some Harlan County residents particularly those employed by coal companies or economically dependent on the industry, argued that Clayton Barnes and his crew had provoked the attack by drilling into disputed territory against management orders. They suggested that while the violence was extreme and unjustified, the Dixon Hollow crew bore some responsibility for creating the situation that led to their deaths. Patricia McCreary and other family members fought against this narrative, arguing that workers following their supervisors' orders shouldn't be blamed for being murdered by corporate contractors. The debate revealed deep divisions in Appalachian communities about corporate power, worker responsibility, and whose interests mattered more when coal and profit were involved. Dixon Hollow Mine was permanently sealed in June 1976, 3 months after the massacre. The decision was made jointly by Appalachian Coal Company and federal mine safety officials, who concluded that the mine could never be operated safely or profitably given the contaminated crime scene, the breach connecting it to Harlan Mining's tunnels, and the psychological trauma that would affect any workers assigned there. The sealing process involved collapsing the main shaft entrance, filling accessible tunnels with concrete, and installing barriers that would prevent anyone from entering the underground passages where 15 men had died. The bodies had been recovered and released to families for burial, but the mine itself remained a tomb, containing the physical evidence of violence that had shocked the nation. Harlan Mining Corporation's North Expansion Shaft was also sealed, closed by federal order as part of the criminal investigation, and never reopened. The disputed boundary zone that had caused the entire conflict remained unmined. The coal seam that 2 companies had been willing to kill over still buried beneath Dixon Hollow. The geological survey that had valued that coal at $60 million became irrelevant. No company would ever attempt to extract it, both because of the legal complications and because the public relations disaster would make any such operation impossible. The coal that 15 men died protecting or trying to claim stayed in the ground, worthless, despite its theoretical value. A memorial was erected near the sealed mine entrance in 1978. The memorial consists of a granite wall inscribed with the names of all 15 victims, their ages, and a simple statement that they were killed while performing their duties as coal miners. Every year on March 18th, families and community members gather at the memorial for a ceremony honoring the dead and remembering the massacre. The ceremonies have gotten smaller over the years as family members have aged, moved away, or died themselves. But the memorial remains a permanent marker of violence that most people outside Harlan County have forgotten, but that shaped how these communities understand corporate power and worker vulnerability. The massacre had broader impacts on coal mining regulations and corporate liability laws. Federal mine safety regulations were strengthened to require better security protocols when competing companies operated in proximity. Corporate executives faced new legal exposure for violence committed by contractors they hired. Labor unions used the Dixon Hollow case as evidence for why stronger worker protections and union representation were necessary to prevent corporations from treating employees as disposable resources. But the reforms were limited and often unenforced, particularly as coal mining declined economically and political attention shifted to other issues. For people who lived through the massacre or lost family members to it, Dixon Hollow became something more than a geographic location. It became a symbol of what happens when human lives are valued less than property disputes and profit margins. It represented the violence that underlies industrial capitalism when corporations decide that killing is cheaper than compromise. And it stood as a warning that justice, even when partially achieved, comes too late for the people who've already died. The Hollow remembers because the people who survived refused to let it be forgotten, even as time moves on and the nation's attention turns elsewhere, even as the coal industry that caused this tragedy continues, operating under different names and in different locations, even as new generations grow up never knowing what happened in those sealed tunnels where darkness still holds the memory of 15 men who went to work one morning and never came home.